My wife came to hug me at the company party, but I pushed her away. Silence swallowed the hall, the background music seemed distant, almost non-existent. All eyes turned to us, frozen at the exact moment my words echoed in the air. I know everything about you and your lover. For a second, I saw the absolute terror in her eyes, the fear gnawing at her expression like a lethal poison. She blinked, opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. I realized right then and there that she wasn't shocked that her betrayal had been discovered. She was terrified because now everyone knew. Shame was a sharp knife stuck in his chest. But what hit me the most, what made my stomach turn the most, was the way she looked around desperately, as if searching for a way out, an excuse, anything that could undo this disaster. I felt the bitter taste of betrayal burning my throat. The whispers began, little whispers that turned into waves of murmurs. Her co-workers' eyes widened, some trying to hide it, others visibly entertained by the unexpected scandal. Was that it then? Did everyone know? How many of those faces staring back at me now had exchanged knowing glances with my wife and her lover? I wondered how many of these people had covered up their lies, how many had smiled at me while keeping a secret I wasn't supposed to know. My chest rose and fell, adrenaline coursing through my veins. His heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was about to explode. And she looked at me as if she was trying to find something inside me, perhaps a trace of compassion, perhaps the hope that this could be resolved silently. But no. I wasn't going to allow her to turn my pain into another one of her secrets. I wanted her to feel. I wanted her to burn in the same fire that lit inside me. Please, her voice came weak, shaky, as if she was suddenly aware of what was at stake. I took a step back. My mind was flooded with memories, the moments we shared, the promises made, the plans for the future. Her laugh at romantic dinners, the way her fingers ran through my hair when I was tired. It all seemed like a lie now. A theater carefully staged so that I would never suspect. How many times has she looked me in the eye and lied through my teeth? How many nights did she kiss me and then go out to find him? Anger consumed me like an uncontrollable fire. Her lover wasn't far away. I saw him, standing on the other side of the room, trying to hide among the other guests, his expression pale, his eyes wide. A coward. He didn't even have the decency to face the situation. I laughed, a cold laugh, devoid of any joy. What it was? Don't you have anything to say? My voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. Everyone held their breath. My gaze returned to my wife. Or did he speak for you too, just as he did everything behind your back? Shame turned to despair. She shook her head frantically. It's not what you think, please don't do it here. Don't do it here. So she wanted to preserve her image, keep up appearances. How ironic. The woman who exposed me to ridicule, who made me a fool in front of so many people, now wanted me to spare her dignity. I refused. She must have felt the same taste of humiliation that I felt at that moment. The lump in my throat grew tighter by the second. How long? Tell me, how long did you think I was dumb enough not to notice? My voice was thick, each word spat out as if it were a poison that I could no longer hold inside me. She opened and closed her mouth, with no response. Tears started to form in his eyes, but I didn't feel sorry. That was fear. Fear of consequences. Fear of the truth that I threw in his face. The silence that followed was more deafening than any noise. The lover took a step back, as if he wanted to escape. And then it happened. The crowd, which had previously just watched, began to move away, giving way to something that no one expected. Her expression changed from pleading to absolute horror. Your eyes searched for him, but he was already moving. Without hesitation, without looking back, he simply turned his back and left. Without caring about her. Without caring about the scandal. He left her there, alone, to face everything. And I saw the exact moment his penny dropped. The moment she realized she was completely alone. What was left for her now? No. That was already over. The lover? He had already disappeared. Your reputation. Stained forever. The bitter taste of betrayal was no longer mine alone. Now, it was hers too. And as she stood there, in the middle of all those judgmental looks, I knew this was just the beginning. Because her real punishment was yet to come. I just needed to wait. And now, she would have to face everything with no one to hold her back. But the question that still hung in the air, the one that no one dared to say out loud, was, how did I know? How did I discover every detail of her betrayal before she even realized she was being watched? How did I plan every second of the humiliation she now faced? And, most importantly, what would happen next? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry an unforgiving truth. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships and leaves irreversible scars. Our goal is to show the real consequences of wrong choices and how disloyalty always takes its toll. Get ready, because what comes next is a shocking, intense story full of twists and turns. Now, take a deep breath, and let's get started. The night sparkled under the reflection of the city's golden lights, where the tall buildings reflected the glow of the streetlights and headlights of the cars that glided through the streets. The company's ballroom was a spectacle of sophistication, decorated with imposing chandeliers, elegantly arranged tables and a stage where a jazz quartet filled the space with soft notes. The smell of expensive wine and refined perfumes hung in the air, mixing with the sound of glasses clinking in toasts and lively conversations. Among the guests, Thomas stood out not only for his imposing presence, but for the way he carried a calculated tranquility in his eyes. He was never one to get excited about social events, but that night had a different weight to it. It was a night to celebrate achievements, to recognize the efforts of a whole year of dedication, and he, as one of the company's managers, needed to be there, alongside his wife, Emma, who, unlike him, seemed to fit in naturally at any social event. Emma was a charming woman, one of those who had a strong presence without having to force anything. With wavy brown hair falling softly over her shoulders and deep blue eyes, she effortlessly captivated. Her light laugh and articulate manner made her desirable company, someone who always had something interesting to say and knew how to maintain a pleasant atmosphere. Unlike Thomas, who was more introspective and reserved, Emma knew how to navigate between people, moving around the room with ease, greeting one by one with warm smiles. Their marriage was seen by many as a perfect balance, he, the firm and rational rock, and she, the vibrant flame that lit up any room. Over the years, they had built a solid relationship, based on respect, admiration and the complicity of a couple who seemed to understand each other without the need for many words. However, even the most stable relationships are susceptible to the subtle changes that life imposes. Time had brought with it new challenges, responsibilities and an increasingly overwhelming routine. Thomas, always very committed to his work, began to dedicate himself more and more to his position in the company, accumulating overtime, traveling for work in constant tiredness that, little by little, began to create a distance between him and Emma. Conversations that were previously long and full of enthusiasm began to be summarized into exchanges of practical information. The nights, previously filled with intimacy, were replaced by tiredness and early sleep. Emma, in turn, tried to maintain harmony, filling the silence with her own energy, but there were moments when she felt alone, as if she were talking to someone who no longer listened to her in the same way. She never stopped loving Thomas, of that she was sure, but the feeling that something was being lost between the two grew every day. Time seemed to devour them little by little, and, as much as she tried to ignore this restlessness, there was something inside her that whispered that things weren't the same as before. That night, as she walked around the room greeting her co-workers, Emma glanced at Thomas from time to time, observing him from afar. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand, leaning on the bar counter, observing the party like a spectator at a theater that didn't belong to him. His gaze was lost in nothingness, as if he were only physically present, but far away. She knew he didn't like parties, she knew he preferred to be at home, and maybe that was what bothered her, the fact that, lately, she also felt this urge to run away, to be somewhere else, or maybe to be someone else, even if just for a moment. Thomas, in turn, watched Emma interact with the others, noticing how she seemed so alive, so involved in conversations, so different from him. He loved her, always had, but recently he felt like something was changing. He couldn't say exactly what, but there was a silent distance between the two, an abyss that was slowly forming and that he didn't know how to stop. Maybe it was the wear and tear of time, maybe it was the weight of responsibilities, or maybe it was just him, unable to show what he felt in the way Emma needed. He wanted to go back to the way things were before, but he didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to tell her that I missed her, that I missed the lightness with which we laughed together, the conversations that went on late into the night, the way her touch was a refuge in the midst of the chaos. The party continued with toasts and speeches. The company's director took the stage to announce the year's results, praising everyone's work and highlighting the new goals. Emma smiled, excited about the recognition, while Thomas just nodded, without much excitement. Deep down, he wondered if all that effort was worth it, if the nights away from home, the sacrificed weekends and the constant tiredness were really worth it. He wanted to believe so, but a part of him wasn't sure. Emma continued her interaction with her colleagues, laughing, talking, while Thomas watched the clock. He wanted to leave, he wanted to escape that party, but he knew that leaving early would only increase the distance between him and Emma. So he remained there, between sips of whiskey, listening to the laughter around him without really hearing them. He felt like something was about to change, as if a storm was silently brewing on the horizon. He just didn't know what it was or when it would come. The atmosphere remained vibrant, but for Thomas, time seemed to slow down. He watched Emma from across the room, the sparkle in her eyes, the way she smiled and the way she seemed completely at ease. Something inside him stirred. He felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of longing and restlessness. He wanted to call her, he wanted her to look at him the same way she looked at others, he wanted her to know that he was there, that he still saw her. But the words didn't come. Then, Emma turned and walked towards her. Her smile still shined, but there was something else in her eyes, something he couldn't decipher. She came closer, put her arms around him, and at that moment, Thomas felt his heart beat faster. But something was wrong. Something inside him, a silent truth that refused to be silent, made him retreat. He felt the warmth of the hug, but he couldn't respond. His body stiffened, and before he knew it, his hands pulled her away. The hall seemed to freeze. The music continued, but somehow, for him, everything was silent. Emma looked at him, surprised, confused. And then, he spoke. His voice came out firmer than he expected, carrying a weight that even he didn't know he was carrying. And in that moment, everything changed. The silence that followed Thomas's gesture pushing Emma away was heavier than any scream could be. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, conversation stopped for a few seconds before starting up again, as if the guests were trying to pretend they hadn't seen anything. But Thomas knew they had. He felt the stares, the muffled whispers, the atmosphere of curiosity mixed with discomfort. Emma blinked, confused, the once bright smile now just an uncertain trace on her face. Her eyes tried to decipher him, to understand what it meant, as if searching for an explanation that he wasn't ready to give. He could say so many things, he could release the sharp words that were stuck in his throat, but not here, not in front of everyone. He saw the way Emma adjusted her posture, trying to regain her composure. She took a half step back, adjusted the hem of her dress and took a quick look around, as if trying to calculate the damage of that moment. Her eyes returned to him, and Thomas felt something different in the way she looked at him now. It wasn't just surprise or disappointment, there was a hidden fear there, a subtle uneasiness that made her stomach turn. Before either of them could speak, someone approached, interrupting the moment. One of Emma's colleagues touched her shoulder and made some comment about the party, trying to lighten the atmosphere between them. She smiled, an automatic, almost rehearsed smile, and turned to answer, but Thomas didn't stay there to listen. Without a word, he turned and walked away, feeling his muscles tense, his breathing quickened. He left the room and walked through the building's corridors, feeling the weight of the night crushing his shoulders. Each step echoed in his mind like an uncomfortable reminder of what was happening, of what he had been ignoring for too long. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he needed a moment to breathe, to move away from the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to engulf him. Outside, the night air was cool, but not cool enough to ease the burning in my chest. Thomas leaned against the wall, closed his eyes for a moment. He didn't want to admit it, but he already knew. Somehow, on some level, he already knew. The subtle changes, the small details, the gestures that were once natural and now seemed carefully calculated. The perfume that was sometimes different, the connections ended in a hurry, the looks diverted at inopportune moments. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle were there, spread out before him, and he finally had the courage to put them together. The party continued, distantly, but the noises seemed muffled, as if the world around them was shrinking. He felt his heart pounding inside his chest, the mixture of disbelief and anger growing like a storm about to break. What would he do? How should I act? The desire to confront her, to demand answers, to expose the truth right there in front of everyone, was overwhelming. But Thomas was never impulsive. He knew he needed something more. Something definitive. He took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face and decided he needed to go back. He needed to see her again, watch her without her noticing. I needed to be sure. He entered back into the building and headed down the side hallway, finding a discreet entrance to the ballroom. From there, he could see without being noticed. Emma was on the other side of the room, talking to some people. She smiled, gestured, seemed completely comfortable. But there was something in her expression, in her behavior, that Thomas now saw with different eyes. He followed her every move, watching the way her eyes roamed the room, as if searching for someone. And then it happened. Emma turned toward the bar, and her gaze met a man across the room. It was quick, almost imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But Thomas was. He saw when her eyes lit up for a second, when her smile became something different, something more intimate, almost complicit. The man responded to the look, discreet, but full of meaning. Thomas's heart froze in his chest. He followed her gaze and found the figure of the man who now seemed to blend in with the other guests, maintaining a controlled posture, as if he didn't want to attract attention. But it was too late. Thomas already knew. That brief moment, that exchanged look, revealed more than any confession ever could. Instincts took over. Thomas moved, walking around the room without really realizing what he was doing. Each step was heavy, carried by the certainty that settled within him like a lethal poison. He didn't know what he would say, he didn't know how that night would end, but he knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. He stopped close enough to hear. Emma was talking to someone else, but her gaze still subtly shifted, checking the presence of the man on the other side of the room. Thomas stood there, motionless, absorbing every detail. The way she tossed her hair to the side, the way her fingers touched her necklace in an involuntary gesture of nervousness. The conversation changed, the people around started to disperse, and then, she moved. Emma picked up her glass, smiled at the person she was speaking to, and, in a casual movement, began walking. Not directly to him, but to the opposite side of the room, where the man was. Thomas followed every step, every gesture, feeling his blood boiling in his veins. They met near one of the hall's columns, away from the main eyes. The man leaned in slightly to say something in her ear, and Emma smiled, lowering her gaze for a moment before responding. The light touch of his hand on her arm lasted a second, but it was enough to confirm everything. Thomas didn't wait any longer. He advanced, closing the distance between them in a few steps. Emma hadn't seen him yet, but the man noticed her approach and straightened his posture. When she finally turned and met Thomas's gaze, the world seemed to freeze. The betrayal didn't need to be said in words. She was there, exposed, raw, revealed in small gestures, in looks that told a story without needing an explanation. And in that instant, Thomas knew. Nothing would ever be the same as before. The silence between Thomas and Emma was an invisible barrier, filled with words that had not yet been spoken. Her expression oscillated between despair and disbelief, as if she was still trying to understand how far he knew, how far this had all come. But Thomas didn't want any more explanations, he didn't need empty justifications or desperate attempts at manipulation. What he wanted was the naked truth, reality without masks, without the veneer of calculated excuses. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment pressing into his chest like a block of concrete. His eyes never left hers, observing every slightest reaction, every nervous movement, every shaky breath that betrayed the internal chaos she was trying to hide. Emma opened her mouth to say something, but hesitated. Thomas saw his gaze escape for a brief moment beyond him, to the man who, until seconds ago, had been at his side. He noticed the subtle tension in her muscles, the fear written in the expression she was trying to hide. The other man didn't say anything, but his body was already moving a step back, as if he was ready to disappear at the slightest sign of confrontation. Coward. Thomas felt the bitter taste of anger rise in his throat. Without taking his eyes off her, he broke the silence. His voice was firm, unhurried, but filled with an overwhelming certainty. He didn't need to scream. The pain he had been holding in all that time now came out like ice, sharp, lethal. He wanted her to feel. I wanted each word to be like a mirror reflecting exactly who she was. Emma tried to touch his arm, but he pulled back before her fingers could reach him. The gesture was a blow to her, and Thomas realized it. He noticed it in the way his face lost color, in the way his lips opened in a silent sigh. Maybe she was finally understanding. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The man next to them let out a heavy sigh, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He tried to maintain a neutral posture, but Thomas could see in his eyes that the weight of shame was already beginning to set in. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment to escape. Thomas then spoke again, but this time, his words were filled with a different venom. He didn't just throw betrayal on the table, he cruelly and accurately exposed everything he knew. The way Emma left work late with flimsy excuses. The calls ended abruptly whenever he entered the room. The subtle smell of a different perfume on his clothes, the small details that, for so long, he had ignored. Each piece falling into place in the puzzle he had refused to see until that moment. Emma shook her head, tears threatening to spill, but Thomas was unmoved. He didn't want tears. He wanted the truth. And then, when her breathing became heavier and the panic in her eyes reached its peak, he knew. There was something more. Something she was still trying to hide. It was at that moment that the final blow came. The twist that Thomas had never imagined, but which now made perfect sense. He looked around, noticing that some people were already paying attention to the scene. Maybe they already knew. Maybe they had already realized it before he did. And then, he asked the question. The one that turned the air in the room into something suffocating. The one that made Emma freeze in place and her lover pale as if he'd been punched in the stomach. Thomas kept his gaze fixed on her, unblinking, as the words came out like a sharp blade. He asked about the secrets she hadn't told. About what else, besides betrayal, was hidden beneath that carefully constructed facade. He wanted her to say it. I wanted the truth to come out of her mouth, for there to be nowhere left to run. And then, she gave in. Not with words at first, but with the look that broke before him. With shoulders that slumped, with breath that caught in her throat. Emma didn't need to say anything for him to understand. But he wanted to hear. He needed to hear. And when the words finally left her lips, it was as if the ground had been ripped out from under her feet. Betrayal had already been enough to destroy him. But this was something else. Her lover hadn't just abandoned her there that night. He had abandoned her before. He never took her seriously. He never had any intention of staying. He used her, made her believe she was special, that there was a future, and then walked away without looking back. And now, in front of everyone, Emma realized that there was no one by her side. That, in fact, she was completely alone. The betrayal that Thomas had discovered was already an open scar, but seeing her there, humiliated, with no more cards to play, was the final blow. She didn't just destroy their marriage, she didn't just throw away everything they had built together. She was discarded as worthless by the very man she risked everything for. Thomas felt something different grow inside him at that moment. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't hate. It was something colder, more resolute. He didn't need to scream. There was no need to fight back. Emma's punishment had already been enacted, and there was nothing he needed to do to make it worse. Without saying anything else, without looking back, he turned and walked out of the hall. Emma stood there, her eyes still wide, watching him leave. Shame burned her skin, reality crushing any illusions she might still have. And in that instant, Thomas realized that all he needed to do was move forward. Because from that moment on, she would have to face everything alone. Thomas walked out of the room without looking back. The night air seemed thicker, filled with something he couldn't name. The cold breeze hit his face, but it brought no relief. The anger, the disappointment, the crushing weight of what had just happened still pulsed inside him, but there was something more. Something that made him continue walking aimlessly, as if he needed to get away from that scene, that moment, that woman who no longer meant anything. The sound of hurried heels behind him cut through the silence of the night. Emma. He didn't need to turn around to know it was her. The heavy breathing, the trembling and hesitant way in which your voice broke in the air when you called out to him. Thomas kept walking, but she persisted, running to catch up to him. She touched his arm, and he stopped, not because he wanted to hear what she had to say, but because he felt he needed to end it there. He looked at her, and for the first time that night, he didn't see the woman he once loved. He saw only a shadow, a blurred portrait of what had once been his wife. Emma was disheveled, her once perfectly straight hair now fell in chaotic waves over her shoulders. The lipstick was gone, and her eyes were red, puffy, as if all the pain in the world had fallen on her at once. Her voice was choked, desperate, full of something he no longer cared to decipher. She was trying to put words together, find sentences that made sense, but Thomas already knew that nothing she said could change what happened. He crossed his arms, watching her with an expression that bordered on disinterest. She took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "Thomas, please, listen to me." He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Now do you want me to listen?" His voice was low, unhurried, but carried by the weight of everything that was stored inside him. "After everything, after every lie, every betrayal, now you want to talk. Tell me, Emma, what exactly do you have to say that isn't an empty excuse?" She took a deep breath, swallowing hard, trying to find the strength to continue. "I made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but Thomas raised an eyebrow, interrupting her. "Error?" He repeated the word as if it had a bitter taste. "Do you think it was a mistake?" "No, Emma, a mistake is forgetting an important date, saying something you shouldn't in a moment of anger. What you did was not a mistake. It was a choice. A choice you've made over and over again." She winced, as if each word was a physical blow. "I was confused, I felt alone, you were always so distant." Thomas laughed again, quieter this time, shaking his head slowly. "Ah, so it's my fault now." He took a step forward, and she instinctively backed away. "I worked to give us a comfortable life. I was always there when you needed me, even when you were exhausted, even when I felt like something was wrong and you insisted everything was fine. But do you know what hurts the most?" He tilted his head slightly, regarding her with something close to contempt. "Knowing that you had chances. That at any time you could have told the truth. You could have looked me in the eye and admitted it. But instead, you chose to lie. He chose to continue. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, tears ran down her face. But Thomas no longer felt anything. I loved you, Thomas. She whispered, her voice fragile, filled with final despair. He let out a long sigh, as if exhausted. No, Emma. You loved the idea of having someone who would never abandon you, who would always come home no matter what. But love? He shook his head. Love does not destroy. Love does not betray. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. The silence between them was an unbridgeable gulf. Thomas ran a hand over his face, as if he were finally releasing a weight he had been carrying for far too long. You know what's worse? He asked, and Emma just looked at him, without answer. You lost everything. Not just our marriage. You lost the respect of everyone who was at that party. You lost whatever dignity you had left. Emma hung her head, defeated. And then came the final blow. Thomas took one last look at her, and then turned, walking leisurely away. Emma stood there, alone, in the cold of the night, hugging herself as if she could pick up the pieces of something that could never be fixed again. The past was behind him. And Thomas knew that from now on, he would never look back. Thomas walked without a specific destination, his steps echoing on the damp asphalt of dawn. The muffled sound of the party still resonated in the distance, but it no longer had any meaning for him. The cold wind bit his skin, but it was nothing compared to the ice he felt inside. Every word spoken, every look exchanged, every silence filled with pain still reverberated in his mind like a broken record. He felt the anger, the humiliation, the loss, but most of all, he felt an emptiness. A black hole that sucked away any trace of feelings he might still have for Emma. He didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to. The world around him seemed indifferent to what had just happened. Cars passed through the streets, some people still walked on bright sidewalks, sporadic laughter echoed from nearby bars. For everyone else, it was just another night. For him, it was the end of everything he knew. He stopped on a random corner, leaned against a post and closed his eyes for a moment. His mind was screaming, his breathing was ragged, and for the first time in years, he felt truly alone. The phone vibrated in his pocket, bringing him back to reality. He already knew who it was before he even looked at the screen. Emma. His name shone there, as if he still had some right to reach him, as if he could still rescue something that was already dead. He watched the screen glow for a few more seconds before pressing a single button. Block. The feeling was strangely liberating. He put his phone in his pocket and kept walking. Hours passed without him noticing. When he finally stopped, he realized that he was in front of the door of an old friend, someone he hadn't seen in years, but who, for some inexplicable reason, was the only person he thought of at that moment. He knocked on the door, not expecting much. Seconds later, the door opened, revealing a surprised but welcoming face. Without a single word, the friend just walked away, giving Thomas space to enter. The smell of coffee and cigarettes hung in the air, mixed with the low sound of an old radio playing some tune. Thomas sat down unceremoniously on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees and running his hands over his face. He still didn't know how to get it all out, how to transform the chaos inside him into coherent words. But at that moment, he realized something. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, he wasn't angry. Anger had been his armor, his immediate response, his strength to stay standing. But now, what was left? He felt a tiredness that was not just physical, but existential. A weight that came from long before the betrayal, long before the night everything fell apart. The friend, without saying anything, poured him a cup of coffee and sat down next to him. They didn't need words. Thomas took a sip, feeling the heat of the bitter liquid run down his throat. He wanted to speak, but at the same time, he didn't want to voice it. As if, By saying it out loud, he made the betrayal more real, more permanent. After a long silence, he finally found the strength to say something. "I don't think I ever met the woman I married." The friend lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly before responding. "Or maybe you did, but chose to see only what you wanted." The words hit him in an unexpected way. He had never thought about it. Had he somehow always known? Were there always signs he ignored? He always trusted Emma, never questioned her gestures, never doubted her words. But maybe, deep down, a part of him always knew something was wrong. He just didn't want to see it. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "And now? What do I do?" The friend let out a low, humorless laugh. "Now? You move on. Or stay here and drown in it. But I know you, Thomas. You were never the type to sit still for long." He wanted to believe it. But how can you move forward when everything you built collapses at once? How could she just carry on when her entire life had been a lie? His friend watched him for a moment before saying something he would never forget. "Her betrayal does not define you. But how you choose to deal with it, yes." Thomas was silent. The betrayal was an open wound, but the choice of whether to allow it to consume him or not was in his hands. He finished his coffee and sat there, reflecting. For the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, his life hadn't ended there. Maybe this was just a fresh start he never knew he needed. Thomas sat on that couch for longer than he could count. The coffee had already cooled in his hands, the weight of the night still haunted his shoulders. The friend remained there, without rushing, respecting the silence, without forcing any words. Sometimes true comfort was just in the presence of someone who didn't require explanations. But Thomas knew he couldn't stay there forever. At some point, he would have to return home, or at least to what he once called home. And then, without warning, he stood up, picked up his jacket, and looked at his friend. He didn't need to say anything. The other man just nodded, as if he understood exactly what was going on. Thomas stepped out into the cold night, breathing in the frigid air as if trying to clear his lungs of all the anger and hurt he still carried. He walked slowly, feeling his footsteps echo on the wet asphalt, and for the first time in a long time, he noticed the silence around him. The noise of the party was gone, the cars were just distant shadows, and the world seemed strangely calm. He didn't have a clear destination when he took a taxi and simply said the name of the street where he lived. As he looked out the window, his mind wandered. Would Emma still be there? Would you have had the courage to return home after what happened? Or were you wandering around, lost, trying to find a way out of the chaos you created? He didn't know what he would feel when he saw her again. Was the hate still there? The disappointment? Or was it just indifference taking over, erasing any trace of what once existed between them? When the taxi stopped in front of the house, everything looked the same. The lights were on, as they always had been. The facade was still the same. But for Thomas, that place was no longer the same. It was just an empty structure, an echo of the past. He paid the driver, got out and stood on the sidewalk for a few seconds before finally getting in. When he opened the door, he found Emma sitting on the couch, curled up, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes red and swollen. Her face lit up with momentary relief at seeing him, as if there was still a chance, as if his presence meant something could be fixed. But Thomas said nothing. He just walked slowly around the room, as if observing that space for the first time. He saw the picture frames on the shelves, the framed memories that now seemed so far away. Each photo told a story, but none of them showed what happened behind. Emma stood up hesitantly, taking a step towards him. The voice was low, trembling. "Thomas. I thought you weren't going to come back." He looked at her, finally truly looking at her, and realized he no longer felt angry. "But I also didn't feel love." It was a strange emptiness, a bitter acceptance of reality. "I don't know why I came back." She blinked a few times, trying to find the right words, but nothing she said now would change what had happened. Still, he tried. I know I have no right to ask for anything. I know I destroyed everything. But I wanted you to know that I regret it. Thomas let out a long sigh, running a hand over his face. Regret, Emma? What do you regret, exactly? What did you do? Or being caught? She trembled, closing her eyes for a moment. Everything. Of every wrong choice. Of having lost everything. Of having hurt you. He laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. You want to know what's worse? It's just that even after everything, I can't feel sorry for you. I can't even hate you like I should. Her eyes filled with tears again. Thomas, please, tell me what I can do. I would do anything to change that. To go back. He took a step back, as if to keep his distance. There is no going back. There is no fix. I spent so long thinking our marriage was strong, that nothing could shake what we built. But the truth is, I was just fooling myself. Because while I believed, you had already thrown it all away. Emma tightened her grip on her arms, as if trying to hold on to something. I wanted to tell you before. I wanted to, but I didn't know how. I was scared. Thomas snorted in disbelief. Fear. You were afraid of losing me, but you weren't afraid of betraying me? She swallowed, no response. He looked around again, feeling the weight of that house, the weight of the past, of memories. And then, he realized something. He didn't want to be there anymore. He turned to her one last time. Keep the house. Keep it all. I don't want anything else from here. Her eyes widened. Thomas, no, you can't just leave like that. He gave a sad half-smile. I can. And I will. She tried to hold him, but he moved away. I spent too much time living a lie. Now, I just want to find something real. And with that, he turned and left, without looking back. The door closed behind him with a final sound, and Thomas knew, in that moment, that he would never return. The night was still cold, but for the first time in a long time, he took a deep breath without feeling the crushing weight of betrayal in his chest. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew that from that moment on, he was free. Thomas moved on, without looking back, leaving behind not just a home, but a past that no longer belonged to him. The early morning cold cut into his skin, but inside him, something had changed. The weight he had carried on his shoulders for so long began to dissipate, giving way to a feeling he hadn't expected to feel so soon, relief. For the first time in a long time, he took a deep breath without feeling the crushing pressure of what it was. What was left now was just emptiness, but a different emptiness. Not one that suffocates and corrodes, but an open space, waiting to be filled by something new. The days that followed were strangely silent. Emma tried to contact him countless times, but he ignored every call, every message, every desperate attempt at redemption. He knew there was nothing more to be said. I knew that any word spoken now would just be a pathetic attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He didn't want justifications. I didn't want patches for something that was already destroyed. He wanted distance. The divorce paperwork went quickly. Thomas didn't want to drag out the process, he just wanted to leave as quickly as possible. He signed everything without hesitation, without even feeling the weight of the cold words that legally defined the end of the marriage. For Emma, this was a shock. She expected resistance, expected some reaction, anything that indicated there was still hope. But there wasn't. His silence was the most brutal response he could have received. She remained in the house that was once theirs. At first, he tried to cling to routine, to pretend that things could still go back to normal somehow. But the truth was cruel. Every room in that place screamed Thomas's name. Every empty space was a reminder of his absence, of what she had lost. The world around her began to crumble in ways she didn't expect. Mutual friends started to move away. Co-workers looked at her differently. The look of admiration he always received turned into silent judgment. And then came the worst part. The lover, the one for whom she had risked everything, the one for whom she destroyed her marriage, went on with his life as if nothing had happened. He wasn't there to help her bear the brunt of the consequences. I wasn't there to hold her when everything fell apart. He disappeared, as if what happened between them had never existed. To him, she was nothing more than a momentary error, a passing distraction. For Emma, it was the bitter realization that she had lost everything to someone who never truly cared. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Thomas didn't look back. He didn't try to find out what happened to her. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't want to carry the burden of the life Emma chose for herself. He was focused on something new. He dedicated himself to his work, but this time, not as an escape. He finally understood that his life didn't have to revolve around the past. And then, unexpectedly, life brought someone new. It wasn't planned, it wasn't forced. It happened naturally, without rushing. Someone who didn't carry the ghosts of a destroyed marriage. Someone who looked at him not with guilt or heaviness, but with genuine curiosity, with real interest. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas allowed himself to feel. He allowed himself to believe that there could be something after the pain, after the disappointment, after the betrayal. Emma, on the other hand, was never able to completely escape the shadow of what she did. Your life has become a constant reminder of your choices. The betrayal that had once been his secret was now his mark. His name was associated with shame, guilt, regret. She tried to move on, but found that moving forward alone was much harder than she imagined. Each person's destiny followed opposite paths. Thomas found peace where Emma found solitude. He rebuilt his life, and she was left trapped in the rubble of the one he destroyed. And so, the story came to an end. Betrayal always takes its toll. Some people pay with a broken heart. Others, with eternal loneliness. But in the end, the truth always finds a way to reveal itself. Now, I want to know what you thought of this story. What was the part that impacted you the most? Comment your opinion. I want to know what you think about this outcome. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, this channel never romanticizes betrayal. Betrayal destroys lives, and consequences always follow. Until next time.